Welcome to An Unconventional Life, a podcast where we share stories about the crazy 1% out there who earned their doctoral degrees and then went on to use them in crazy, cool, unique, and unconventional ways. Here's your host, astrophysicist turned teacher, author, dissertation coach, and more, Dr. Russell Strickland.
Hello and welcome to An Unconventional Life podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Strickland, the founder and CEO of Dissertation Done. And I have with me today Dr. Sharon Belden Castonguay. She is an adult developmental psychologist with Wesleyan University. Interested in what an adult developmental psychologist is. We're going to talk about that a little bit and how adults continue to develop through their career choices. So excited to have Dr. Castonguay with me today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are quite welcome. Want to let everyone know that today's episode is brought to you by Dissertation Done. At Dissertation Done, we help adult doctoral students and guide them through the dissertation process. So whether you are very proactive and just getting ready to start your dissertation and looking for some guidance and support, or you feel a little bit slowed, stalled, or just plain stuck on the dissertation and you need someone to help you through to graduation, reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/done. And we'll see if you're a good fit for our Fast Track Your Dissertation coaching program. And if by chance you maybe have already graduated and you're working in the expert space, perhaps you are a coach or consultant or counselor, and you would like to get your authority out there and elevate your credibility, the best way to do that is by becoming a published author. And through our Expand Your Authority Expert Author program, we help you go from the blank page to published author faster than you think you might be able to. You can find out more by getting in touch with us at dissertationdone.com/book. Again, Dr. Castonguay, thank you so much for being here today. I always ask our students, or rather our guests on the podcast, to tell us a little bit about what motivated you to pursue your doctoral degree in the first place. Tell me a little bit about that. It's kind of a crazy decision to most people out there in the world to join that 1% who earns their doctoral degree. What motivated you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I entered the field of career development after receiving a master's degree in my 20s, and I ended up working at a business school, coaching MBA students and teaching a course on career development. And I was there during the .com rise and crash.
Yeah, it happened kind of quickly, didn't it?
It really did. And it was a very interesting time to be working in career development, particularly with early to mid-career and even some quite late career clients, because part of my job was working with alumni of the MBA program that I was working with as well. So I had people in their 20s who would have their job offers pulled, as well as people in their 50s and early 60s who were getting laid off from their jobs. And I got really interested in the aspects of resilience that was coming from that, and how people made sense of those experiences and how they were processing, what was going on in the economy and how it was affecting them. And I ended up deciding that I really wanted to study this further and in a more formal way. And I'd always had it in the back of my head that I might get a doctorate. When I did my master's degree, that was actually in secondary education. It had a lot of adolescent focus. I'd had this idea where eventually I'll go back and get a PhD in education policy, this kind of thing. And that wasn't where I landed, obviously, but when I decided to get a doctorate, I actually had a really hard time thinking through programs, because what I wanted to do was very specific and very interdisciplinary.
Right.
And I probably would have been a good fit for an organizational behavior department in a business school, but I had kind of burned out of that culture and experience and wanted something different. So I started looking at psychology programs and sociology programs, and ended up in a human development and psychology program, largely because they were going to allow me to be far more interdisciplinary than most straight psych or soc programs were going to allow me to do.
So having that broad exposure was something that was very important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, career development is by definition an interdisciplinary field. I wasn't interested in taking a very narrow lens of just reading career development theory. Like, I really wanted to think very broadly about how American culture and aspects of identity and time and place, all affect this type of decision making.
And obviously this is going to lead into part of our later discussion, but what was the why for moving into this field? You mentioned you were interested in studying, but what did you want to be when you grow up, so to speak, with your doctoral degree?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because by that point I had been working in higher ed. By the time I went back, I'd been working in higher ed for about 5 years, I think. And I knew a little too much about it to want to go into the professoriate.
Yeah.
I knew what all the pitfalls were of, the publish or perish environment, how long I'd have to start over career-wise, and I wanted to stay within the field of career development. And I wasn't ruling out going the traditional route, and becoming a professor. And I was getting a research degree. For all that I have an Ed.D. At my institution at that time, that was a research degree. And I knew, though, that as my program went on, I knew what I would have had to have done to have managed my educational experience and my research in my program in order to line myself up to get a faculty position when I graduated. And I didn't do those things. And I didn't do those things consciously because they just weren't that important to me. The other thing that I was doing was, even though I was on paper a full-time doctoral student the entire time I was in the program, I never really stopped working.
Right.
I know I was a few hours a week. Yeah, basically my former employer had kept me on 1 day a week to kind of mop up a lot of that alumni advising after the crash when I started my doctorate in 2002. But by 2004, when I finished all of my coursework, I was working half or upwards of 3/4 time as a career counselor or teaching or, doing other things. And I was really keeping my options open, I think, while I was in the program. I was continuing to build my contacts and my reputation in the field of career development, while at the same time thinking, okay, well, do I want to do this in the private sector? Am I going to completely rule out the traditional academic route? Are there still things I might consider within that realm? So I really kind of kept all options on the table right up until the year I graduated.
And that's the thing that some students who are in the doctoral program lose sight of. They have a particular vision or particular set of goals, and they focus on that, which is good. That's how you get to where you want to be, is by being intentional. But keep in mind that there are so many options available to you once you get to the other side of that stage. It just amazes me how many times our former students and other people I've taught to have said, when I was completing my doctoral degree, I never thought I would be doing this thing that I'm doing right now. And I can count myself as one of those people.
Right.
I didn't know that this was a thing, quite honestly, when I was getting started on my doctoral degree. So that's really good. As you're going through your doctoral process, how did you find that process? You mentioned that you were working varying amounts of time while still going through a traditional research program. How did you juggle things, and did you find that there were any particular challenges unique to being, an adult going through this process rather than a sort of 20-some-year-old kid?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I was lucky, I think, relative to a lot of adult learners in this space. Adult being a relative term. I was 30 when I started, but I was still single.
Yeah.
So I didn't have, unlike some of my classmates, I wasn't taking care of kids. I wasn't, I didn't have a lot of these other things going on the side that were taking up, time and energy. And it's funny because part of the reason I went back when I did as well was thinking about, well, I'm turning 30, and it was almost like a turning 30 crisis kind of thing too. Cause it's like, well, all right, I'm turning 30, I'm single. By the time I met somebody, dated them, got married, I could have a doctorate done. Which is more or less what happened, actually. So I was in absolute just full-time coursework those full 2 years, working just a little bit on the side, as I mentioned. But then in that third year, what ended up happening was a former colleague of mine had started working in the career office at my university. And he called me up and said, hey, we have a half-time position available for someone to be a career counselor for PhDs who don't want to be academics.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I said, ooh, that sounds like fun. And I was very lucky.
Myself up for that. I need to talk to myself about what to do if I don't want to be an academic.
It was a really interesting job. And I was very lucky that the funding that I had in my program was not tied to doing research or teaching.
No, very good.
So, I mean, I had a free and clear stipend, so I can pick and choose what kind of work I wanted to be doing on the side. So actually by my third year, my income was about what it was before I started the program, because I had a half-time job and I was getting a graduate stipend.
Yeah.
You know, all from the same university. So, I mean, from an income standpoint, I was back to where I started, 2 years in, which was good because I was in Boston, which is an extremely expensive place to live,
Right.
and a very difficult place to be a graduate student. So it's not like I was living large. I could like own a car and buy groceries,
Right.
Relative to most graduate students.
I was a graduate student in Chicago.
Yeah,
So,
it's hard in those big cities, right? As you know, to try to support yourself on a stipend.
but they got a few more schools in Boston. You would tend to think there would be some sort of culture somewhere in there that would help a student out, right? Because there's a couple of schools in Boston.
There's over 60 schools in Boston, but so a lot of people live in Boston. It's a very, very expensive place to live, but I was able, because it was a half-time position, I was able to juggle both. But then what started to happen is other things started creeping in. So another local business school called me up and said, hey, would you like to do 1 day a week working with our students? And then I had the opportunity to be a teaching fellow, for a couple of different classes and topics that I genuinely love. So I wasn't teaching because I had to for the money, like a lot of full-time doctoral students and research programs do. But, teaching adult development, teaching cross-cultural counseling, things that were very near and dear to my heart. And that did extend my graduation. When I started, I said, even though I'm doing a qualitative dissertation, which, as you know, takes longer, right, than doing something that's more statistics focused, I said I would be out in 5 years. Like, I was holding myself accountable for being out in 5 years, and it took 7. And it's because I was working 3/4 time, by year 3. And was really only a full-time doctoral student on paper.
And that's, again, something where as adults, we all get to decide what's important to us and what our priorities are. And so you can always change your mind. You can say, I want to be out in 5. No, actually, I want to do these other cool things that I'm doing. Because they're talking about doing the math. I'm like, okay, half-time here, a couple of teaching gigs there, another day a week there. I mean, you're up to like 8 or 9 days a week.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the other thing I was doing at the same time was I was very involved in the rowing community in Boston.
Okay.
I was involved with the local boat club before I started the program. And part of the reason I stayed in Boston was because I wanted to keep rowing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was getting up, very early in the morning for practice during the season. I was training at night in the off season, not doing anything super competitive, but it's a hobby that meant a lot to me that I took seriously and spent a lot of time on. So, but I also think it's healthy for doctoral students to be able to do something that has nothing to do, with their work, because you got to have an outlet. And for some people, that's family, and that wasn't my thing at that time. I have a family now, but that, at that point in time, rowing was kind of my thing.
Yeah. Now, what does getting up early in the morning practicing mean? I mean, you're out on the trawls, or is this like in a gym? Yeah. You're out.
No, during the season, I was up at 4:30.
Yeah.
For a 6, we would be out on the water by 6.
Okay. And literally on the water, you're on the river.
On the river.
Wow. So when is the season? Because, I know, like I said, I went to graduate school in Chicago where it gets.
Yeah, I rode in the snow.
In like August. I mean, in October, it starts to get.
Yeah, April to October was our season at the club I belonged to. But there were definitely, and October's actually not bad, but there were times in April where it would be snowing in the boat.
Yeah. Yeah, there were, I remember in Chicago, snow on the ground in October and snow on the ground April's pushing it, but possibly, yeah. So, which is not, it was a new experience for me growing up in North Carolina
Right.
to see any snow, but that much was really something new.
No, I'm from Rhode Island, so I was used to it.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, those days when we had in Chicago, the high was in the single digits, or I think there were a couple of times where the high was negative. Like, whoa, what? That's really something. And then leaning into the wind as you're going to class.
Oh yeah.
I can't imagine, in addition to that, actually being on the water rowing. But in the summer, I imagine it was absolutely gorgeous to do that.
Indeed.
So you mentioned earlier that you had a story about a famous advisor, and it sounds like maybe things didn't go so well. Maybe.
It's not as badly as I like to joke. I like to joke that I fired my famous advisor, which isn't strictly speaking true, but I like to joke about it. So, one of the things that was tricky about finding a doctoral program was who would my advisor be? When I'm advising undergraduates now who are thinking about going back and doing graduate work, I say, when you're looking at finding this type of program, what you're really shopping for is that advisor. You have to think about what it is that I want to do research on. What is the burning research question that is keeping me up at night, and who in these programs can advise me on that? And that's a large part of the admission process as well, because these committees want to know that they can pair you up with an advisor. So in any program I looked at, there wasn't a lot of options for people who did specifically the type of work that I wanted to do, or even peripherally the type of work that I wanted to do. But my program did have a couple of people who were more focused on adults within the developmental psychology space, and that was really what I wanted. And I took a class with one of them in my first semester, and it was amazing, but I knew he was really oversubscribed. He was also one of the very few people I've ever met who could truly intimidate me. He was really famous and really intimidating. And the other guy was really famous, but somehow less intimidating, just personally. Yeah. And I took his class as well. So I ended up asking him to be my advisor, and he was my advisor through the qualifying paper stage. So my program had a bit of a different timeline than most doctoral programs. I think they've changed it now, but back when I was doing it, what you did was just 2 years of full-time coursework, and then you took time to either do a pilot project or a qualifying paper. And this was a precursor to the dissertation stage.
Okay.
And because I had done a pilot study as part of my coursework, I had chosen to do my qualifying paper as a literature review, looking specifically at what is like the interplay of aspects of masculinity with career decision making.
Okay.
Particularly within the business world. And as a result, it very interdisciplinary. I needed to draw heavily from organizational behavior. And I had started going across the river to the business school to ask a professor there for advice on what I should be reading in the org behavior space to help inform what I was doing in the more psychology, sociology space as well. And I was discovering that my advisor was just so oversubscribed that every time I met with him, he was having a hard time even remembering what I was doing.
Right.
And that was getting a little frustrating.
Yeah.
And then at pretty much the moment that I was getting to the point of doing my dissertation proposal, so after your qualifying paper gets accepted, you then do a dissertation proposal. That professor that I had been working with at the business school ended up coming over to the Graduate School of Education. And I said, okay, like this is the university telling me I need to change advisors.
Yeah.
So I went in and talked to my original one. He was very understanding. And I'm pretty sure I was her first advisee, dissertation advisee. She's now been there for, well over a decade. But
so your eventual advisor, you're saying you think you were her first student. Okay.
Yeah, at least on that part of campus. I'm not sure about the business school because they had doctoral candidates there as well. But
the personality thing, particularly at big name institutions, it does rear its head.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I worked with a really big name advisor when I was at University of Chicago, and a couple of the other folks in the group were arguably not as successful. They were very, very well known. So this is all, splitting hairs on the top of the mountain kind of thing. but you could tell just a difference in his, confidence and self-assuredness. He never felt like he had to prove himself. And he was an awesome guy. Unfortunately, he died before I was able to graduate. He was involved in a plane crash, and that kind of fomented some of the decisions that I made later on, because your advisor, like you said, is so important in your graduate program. But I'm glad you were able to find the right person to get you through, because that is so critical. Tell me a little bit more about defending your dissertation proposal.
Yeah, so the way that another sort of oddity of my program, and again, I don't know if they still do it this way, but they did at the time, was that instead of defending your dissertation at the end,
yep,
you defended your proposal at the beginning.
Right.
And my understanding behind that was that it was to make sure that all of the faculty on your committee were on the same page right from the start, because they had run into problems with that not being the case, yeah. that was delaying people's graduations.
Yeah.
So they had this ritual at the time where, when it came time to defend your dissertation proposal, and it was a lengthy process to write the dissertation proposal. It had to be very well thought out. You had to IRB approval, the whole thing. Right. And then when it came time to formally go in and defend, and your defense was recorded, it was typically done first thing in the morning, and you were supposed to bring breakfast for your dissertation committee. So I went
walking up to all of the rich faculty members.
Right. So you as a graduate student, in other words, yeah, we're on the hook. So, I
bribe to finish to defend the proposal.
I went to one of our local chains, Aubon Pen, and I got, a bunch of breakfast foods, and I had just started dating this guy who said, he was excited. He was a postdoc at a neighboring institution, and he was excited that I was defending my dissertation proposal. So he actually came with me to help carry everything.
Uh-huh.
And we'd been dating for, I think, 2 weeks at this point. And so he helped me, or maybe a month. I certainly know more than that. And he helped me carry everything upstairs and, into the library where we were doing this. And my committee's looking at him and thinking, wow, you got a guy to help you bring your breakfast stuff. And how long is this, your boyfriend? And I was like, no, it's just some guy I just started dating. And anyway, we've been married now for over a decade.
So is that the marriage test? If they'll take your breakfast up to your dissertation defense?
He impressed my dissertation committee, so I felt the need to marry him at the end. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a good idea to have that proposal defense in there for 2 reasons. Number one, it just depends on your institution, but a lot of traditional institutions, the dissertation process, it's really a master-apprentice relationship. And in my experience, students don't necessarily have a dissertation project that they're working on per se. Instead, they do work with their professor, and at some point the professor turns to them and says, okay, let's package some of this up and get it out the door so you can graduate. And that's a slow process, which, if you want to be in the research community and that's what you're going to be doing, is great, because you're working at the foot of the master, you're meeting all those people, making all those connections, publishing often before you actually finish your dissertation. All great stuff. But for people who want to go outside of academia, it's really nice to have a dissertation that's a project and you know what it's going to entail. And to have a defense early on requires that you know what the beginning, middle, and end of your project is, what it looks like to finish. And that's really bodes well for you completing the thing. So I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think what you're describing, having worked with PhD candidates across disciplines, what you're describing is far more common in the sciences.
Yeah.
Whereas, when I was coming in a social science discipline and not being tied to the research, I think had I been involved, like that, going back to my first advisor, I was a teaching fellow for him, so I was very familiar with his theories. And had I done a dissertation that was making active use of those theories, and I was working with him on his research, things might have looked a little bit different in that regard. But I had very strong opinions on what I was doing and what this was going to look like. And I think that's one of the benefits of being an older student, is that, you're coming in with some life experience, you're coming in with some professional experience. You do have ideas of what you want to do, right. And you have to make sure that you have an advisor who's willing to go along with you, frankly. I turned out to be a spectacularly bad advisee, and I'll do a post apology now to my dissertation advisor, because the reason I say I'm a bad advisee is I had a tendency to ignore the advising process until I felt I was actually done with something. So, proving that point, I think I turned in the first draft of my dissertation something like a month before the deadline.
Yeah.
And it gave her a heart attack, because I remember her saying to me, like, it's a good thing that this actually turned out to be good, because you really pushed the envelope on that. And I said, well, I'm just not a draft person, you're going to get this 85% done. It's not to say I didn't have iterations of it after that, but I wasn't giving them little chunks.
Yeah. And you were spectacularly lucky that you had a well-adjusted mentor, because a lot of mentors, just the fact that you didn't get their opinion and incorporate it back in your work, however superficially, would have been a death knell for you, because
yeah. And there was some of that.
Often goes. Yeah.
It's not like she had no idea what I was doing, because again, right. they had signed off on my proposal, which was very detailed.
Right.
So, I mean, they knew exactly what my interview protocol was, and she had very strong opinions about that, exactly who, what these were going to look like. Right. At some point I had shared the coding that I was doing. It's not like they didn't see anything, but in terms of like the write-up, the actual product, I waited until fairly, and I knew I was confident enough in my writing and in I was following a preordained structure. Right. I felt okay about it, but
I just know several committee members and chairs who, if they didn't tell you, well, this is good, but why don't you do X, Y, or Z, and X, Y, and Z didn't show up in a later draft,
yeah,
it wouldn't have happened. It doesn't matter how incremental X, Y, and Z would have been to your work. It would have been critical as far as getting the approval. Again, marginal to the work, but critical to the approval of the work. And that's where the well-adjusted mentor comes in, to not need that sort of sense of, self-aggrandizement that they, contributed in a meaningful way to your work.
Yeah, no, and there were definitely things that I ended up having to add and subtract, and even some of the later editions needing to subtract because of, committee members saying, well, I want to see this. No, I want to see. It's not like that didn't happen. But I actually think one benefit of pushing this to fairly late in the game was it forced them to make decisions as opposed to stringing me along, because they wanted to see me hit the same graduation date that I was trying to hit.
And that's also a good stroke of luck, because a lot of times committee members don't care.
I think they were under pressure to get doctoral students out more quickly, frankly. I mean, I was already at the 7-year mark by that point, and I was so close that it was like, okay, let's just make sure this gets done.
Happens. Yeah. So you mentioned defending the proposal. Was there a final defense for the dissertation? Did that happen as well? Not at all.
No, they don't. It was just the way they did. And again, I'm not sure that they do it the same way now, but at that time, you didn't do an oral defense again at the end. Mm-hmm. Obviously they were signing off on the written document, and you were having a fair amount of back and forth about that. And there was actually a formal process that you had to go through with the administration and
but that's the bureaucratic red tape. That's not, I like the fact that
it wasn't a traditional defense. No.
Yeah. A lot of universities will have a defense. Some of them it'll be a real defense, but a lot of them these days it's more of a celebration. It's expected you're going to pass. And I like that kind of ritual of, having the wine and cheese and the congratulations and all of that sort of thing, as being a nice capstone to this whole process. What was it like to just sort of unceremoniously have them sign your paper and push it over
I wasn't living on campus at that point. My now husband, then fiance, had, by the time I was getting that close to graduating, he had been teaching in upstate New York.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote my dissertation in upstate New York, which is a great place to live on a graduate student stipend. That was the year that I
worked very,
very little, because you can live on a small amount of money in the middle of nowhere, right? And that was nice. But what I remember being the big closing was commencement.
Okay.
You know, I mean, the full regalia, I bought my regalia. I still have it.
Have mine.
Yeah, you know, we had a beautiful day, and it's all day ceremony after ceremony after ceremony at a big university like that. And I just engaged in all of it. And I remember it very fondly, and it did feel like closure.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good point. And that's one of the reasons why I always encourage a lot of our students, their commencement is months after their graduation, you know, after they're done, and they could have their transcript, they could have their degree, but the commencement comes later. And I encourage folks to do go to that, because, you know, it's all this silly, cheesy fun, but it's worth it. You know, either
Right.
you have a wonderful commencement speaker, or you're going to make snarky comments about your commencement speaker. You know, you get to see the people that advised you sometimes for the first time. When I went to my commencement, my advisor saw me walk across the stage, did a little mental snapshot, and then found me at the reception. And that is the first time we'd ever met, because I did my work remotely, but before you know, the rise of everyone's picture being on the internet and video conferencing and all these other things. So we just did everything via phone and email. And it was literally the first time I had ever met him was when he came up and shook my hand at commencement. So definitely a good way to end that endeavor. You mentioned that kind of going on past that dissertation journey, you mentioned that 2009 was a year of change. What? That sounds interesting.
That's actually the year that I graduated. So I like when people doing what I do in career counseling, we talk a lot about, you know, change and transitions.
Yep.
And I always like to talk about 2009 because I got engaged on New Year's Day. My husband proposed first thing in the morning on New Year's Day in 2009. And he had been invited to a conference on St. Simon's Island in March, or the end of February. I take it back, it was the end of February. So I gave myself a deadline of finishing that big first draft of my dissertation for that trip, because I wanted to be able to just say that I had finished it, sent it off to my advisor, and then enjoyed that trip. But then my dissertation was basically done a month later.
Yes.
I walked in June. We got married in July, moved to New York about 2 weeks later, because he had accepted a tenure track position at a school just outside New York City.
Okay.
I did some consulting work in the fall, but then ended up starting a new position as the director of a business school career office the first week of December. And I found out Christmas week that I was pregnant with our daughter.
Okay. And what was the change in there?
Yeah. So it was like every major life change you could have.
Right there.
Pretty much all in one calendar year.
Events in life, basically the moving, the marrying, the having a kid, the changing.
All in one, all at once.
All of it.
Just all of it.
Luckily, you got most of the dissertation done before you started doing all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that was the beginning of the year. I mean, it was actually really nice timing in the sense that, you know, I turned in my dissertation and actually got to just take a few months to relax and plan my wedding, which was nice.
My firstborn was born in at the very end of December, and I defended my dissertation in April, but it was essentially all over, you know, except for the officious pro forma stuff when he was born, which I thought was very, very smart of me, because otherwise I didn't know what would happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, what was tricky was, you know, basically getting pregnant my first week at a new job was a little tricky because, you know, I was a
reliable employee, but I'm going to need some time off in about 9 months here.
You know, it was kind of like, ooh, didn't think that was going to happen that fast, you know, and, you know, I'm managing a team. My maternity leave ended up coinciding with the very first recruiting season that I was responsible for, because I was, you know, working with MBA students still at that point. It was very awkward timing. But you know, that's life, right? There's always going to be awkward timing. And I'm sure that a lot of the folks you work with find that as well. You know, there's never a good time to do anything in life. There's just a time.
Exactly right. There's never a good time. You just have to decide what's important and make some get your priorities together and figure out how to make everything work. Because we have so many students that are juggling, kids and career and they're married. Sometimes you're caring for parents in some way, shape, or form. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in life as that we as adults have to face. I tell folks that you plan, but you never know what's going to happen. I have not had a single year of my adult life that went exactly the way I would have scripted it on January 1. Just doesn't happen. So forget about, do the planning so that you can riff off the planning and have some sense of intentionality, but also understand that things are going to be happening, that make you change those plans.
Yeah, I think everybody learned that in 2020, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. My son's 15 now. His new favorite movie is Forrest Gump. And, at the end, he asked, something about some deep philosophical question about life, whether it's, Lieutenant Dan says that everything is just, random and his mother says that it's all planned and preordained. And he stops and says, well, I think maybe it's both. I'm like, but he's got a bit of a point that you plan, and then you change your plans as the situations dictate. So how does that tie into some of these career decisions that adults have to make? What sense of planning versus serendipity do you think comes into these career decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I find when I'm working with folks who are a bit older, let's say, people who are in their 30s and they're starting to think,
You sound like my kids.
what is,
well,
well, I mean, I'm well beyond that. I'm just saying, like, people, in other words, who might already be on their second or third career,
right, sure.
Or maybe they stumbled into something after they graduated and they're not really happy and they're not sure why. It's often because they didn't really unpack all of the things that were influencing their career decisions early on. And most of my career up until I took my current position at Wesleyan was working with graduate students and working with mid-career folks. And part of the reason that I wanted to go back to my roots, I'm a graduate of a liberal arts college, I work for one now, was to nip in the bud some of what I was seeing with people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, et cetera, which is it's work. You've got to do the work to figure out, how do I go about making these decisions, and what are all the things that are influencing these decisions? There's a lot. What are all the different identities that I'm bringing to bear? How am I internalizing all of these cultural influences that I might be receiving from my parents, from my peers, from the institutions I attended, from American culture, from my culture of origin? If that's relevant, I work with a lot of international students or people who don't identify with the dominant culture in the US, and having to really think through, how are all of these things motivating me or influencing me in positive or negative ways? And if you don't do that, it's really easy to follow the path of least resistance. And I've talked about this in my dissertation. My dissertation looked at people who graduated during the down job market in the early 90s.
Right.
And when I interviewed them, they were on average about 15 years out. And this was before, the big crash in 08, 09, when I was talking to them. So on paper, they were actually all doing very well. But when you asked them to go back to when they graduated from college, a lot of them were doing things like, I was a cashier in a liquor store, I was a bank teller, they had taken these like jobs that were not matching up with their degrees.
Right.
And a lot of what was coming out of those narratives was serendipity, which, I like to describe it as the intersection between luck and hard work. You can't just rely on things falling into your lap, but nor can you expect that every single thing you try to do is going to pan out, right? So that's really serendipity, but being open to new things, new experiences, because while I found that virtually everyone that I interviewed started out on the path of least resistance. Okay, well, I'm graduating in a crappy job market, so I'm just going to take the first thing that comes to me. Some of them were really thoughtful about, okay, well, maybe I'm going to take a temp job, but it's going to be a temp job at a company that really interests me. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and make a point of trying to develop relationships with some of the people who are here and really learn about what are some of the things that are going on. So maybe I can be on the lookout for when things improve and their hiring freeze lifts. Maybe I can eke my way to an entry-level position. And it wasn't always that straightforward. You know, sometimes people talk, well, then I took another job that wasn't that great, but I learned something from the experience and I made another contact that exposed me to this other new thing. And a lot of it was about how people made sense of those experiences and how much were they reflecting on those experiences.
Right.
It was that reflection piece that was really important. Could they actively think about, how am I reacting to this work experience that I'm having?
Exactly.
And what is that, recursive relationship between, what I am doing and what I am thinking, what's happening at this organization, and then thinking, okay, well, if I'm not happy with what I'm doing, is it because of a bad fit with the functional area? Is it a bad fit with the organization? Do I need to be doing a complete rehaul, or is there some piece of this I can keep? And being able to be actively engaged in that active reflection, it was what's really important. And that's what I think is the basis of the work that I do now as the director of the University Career Center, is really encouraging students to develop those mental tools to be actively reflecting on, what is it that I want out of life?
Yeah. I think that notion of actively reflecting and really analyzing what's going on, that's the difference between an employee with 10 years experience and an employee with 1 year of experience that they repeated 10 times.
Yeah.
You have people that really grow and develop, and you have other people that honestly you couldn't tell if they've got 3, 4, 5, or 10 years of experience, because yes, they've been here and they know some folks, but they haven't taken that time to reflect and figure out what can I bring forward from this year into next year so that I'm better off. People talk about, when you improve 1% a day or whatever, you're twice as good, in well under a year. That sort of thing is something I think that a lot of people don't actively reflect on and don't actively steer the wheel. So what if the tide is rough or whatever the case might be? If you've got a hand on the rudder, at least you got some control over the situation. Think about where you're going and where you want to go, and what has knocked you off course. What can you learn from that?
Yeah, and it was people, and I saw this both in my dissertation research as well as in my advising practice, is people who don't feel like they have control tend to be the ones who are really unhappy. And I mean, the organizational behavior literature bears that out in
Right.
general terms. If you don't feel like you have control over your work life, you're probably not going to be very happy. People feel like they have a sense of agency. But I think, generally speaking, in the career sphere, if you're thinking about, am I happy with the work that I'm doing right now? Do I need to make a change? That is a very big part of it. Like, do I have the power to make a change, and how much agency do I have over making this change? And can I make things better is a big part of it, because people who do believe that it's okay for them to leave this employer that's not working for them.
Right.
And that they can, in fact, find something else, and that they know how to do that, because there is a practical component to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do people know how to build professional relationships, and do they know how to maintain, say, their social media presence in the right way? And that's a part of what we're doing in the university career development space as well, is giving students, teaching them how to manage their careers in a very practical sense, as well as learning how to make choices over time, because people don't obviously stay in the same thing anymore.
Right.
When students graduate from college, we don't assume they're going to keep doing the same thing for more than a year or two.
Right. And it's interesting. I wonder how much this is taught in school. I mean, I was talking with someone not long ago about all the things that we don't teach our kids in school, balancing a checkbook and compound interest and a variety of things along those lines, and how hard it is to remove digital footprints from social media once you do something when you're a kid. It shows up on your college applications and your job applications and all this sort of thing. But you're mentioning an entirely different set of skills for nascent adults that are necessary as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the president of a consortium called the Liberal Arts Career Network, and we have small liberal arts colleges all over the country that are really looking at this idea of, how are we best supporting these students who are being very broadly educated, they're not picking a vocational major like accounting and then walking into one accounting job.
Correct.
But they're also very successful on the job market, and they're very successful as leaders in whatever it is they do go on to do, but helping give them the mental tools and the practical tools to be making wise decisions. So they're not finding themselves, say, 3 years into medical school, realizing they don't want to be a doctor. Like, you want to nip that kind of thing in the bud.
That would be a good idea. I don't like blood.
Exactly. And at schools, at highly selective schools like Wesleyan, you get a lot of students who come in with very preconceived notions of what success is.
Yes.
My parents are saying I have to be a doctor or a lawyer, and helping them think through that as well. Well, I'll have students who I have an online class that helps students think through this, that we push out to students when they enter Wesleyan. And I'll have students who are reflecting on, well, I'm realizing now that maybe I don't want to be a doctor, but I'm really interested in public health or biomedical engineering. They're not leaving the idea of, getting rid of the idea of being a doctor in favor of being an underwater basket weaver. They're choosing something that is just a different way of using, say, their talent in science.
Right. What would you say to, we work with a lot of folks that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s even, who are getting their doctoral degree, and most of them are doing it. Some of them have very, very specific goals in mind. But as I mentioned to you before, there are so many people I talk to that say, I would have never predicted I would be doing this thing, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years after I graduated while I was getting my degree. Any advice you would have for someone who's in that process right now about how they should be thinking about utilizing their doctoral degree once they earn it, and when they should really be focusing on those sort of post-graduation thoughts as opposed to just getting it done?
Yeah. When I work with PhD candidates, people who have received that degree, the way that I like to frame this question is really thinking about how close or far away do you want to be from the ideal of your discipline? Mm-hmm. So meaning, let's say your degree is in chemistry. The ideal in that discipline is you're a primary investigator in a lab at a Research One university, and you're getting a lot of, big federal grants, and, you've got all these people working for you. And I refer to that as a point. So I said that's this one point that's considered the ideal, okay, for that world. And then the farther away you get from that, the further away you get, the more options open up. So it becomes sort of cone shaped, right? Where, let's say, well, sometimes I would talk to folks who would say, well, okay, I still love my discipline. Mm-hmm. I still love chemistry. But the idea of having to scramble to constantly get these grants to keep my lab running, my PI now is a Nobel Prize winner and he has a hard time getting grants. I just don't want to have to put myself through that, but I love being at the bench. So they'll look at, corporate positions, industry positions at the bench.
Right.
And then you'll get folks like my husband who would say, well, what I love is teaching.
Yes.
I don't feel like I get to do enough of it. There's all this pressure to publish, and I enjoy research, but it's really not what gets me up in the morning. What gets me up in the morning is teaching others. So if I was talking, and my husband chose to actually really focus on teaching. But then you'll get people who say, well, no, what I want to do is teach at an even higher, at sort of a different level. I want to go into science journalism.
Okay, well,
now I'm going to translate what other science, so I'm not a scientist anymore because I'm not doing the science, but I'm translating the science for other people.
Yeah.
But the further away you get, the more options open up.
True.
And that's going to be true no matter what you're studying.
Right. That's right.
But I usually start people on that mental journey by thinking about, how close or far away do you want to be from that discipline? And is it okay if you get so far away that you're no longer identified with it? Right. Are you still a chemist?
You're not a chemist anymore, right?
You're not a chemist anymore. Like, other chemists won't consider you a chemist, and is that going to be okay?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of identity, people get acculturated into these professions. Mm-hmm. And it can carry a very heavy mental load.
Yeah.
depending on how they're being socialized in their programs.
Well, I like some of the things you said there about the questions they were always asking is, what do you love to do? What parts of this thing that you're studying now, or this identity that you would have as a chemist, for example, what parts of that do you like? And it's okay, I don't like the administrative pieces, I don't like the funding pieces, but I do like, running experiments, designing experiments, just doing that work. I like that. There's some calming to it. Me, I don't have to deal with people. I just get to deal with the chemicals, and the chemicals always do what I tell them to do. And whatever the case is, knowing what you like and what you connect with, I think is really important. And then it also got me thinking of in my mind, a key example of this notion of what is the ideal of your profession and how far away do you want to be from it. When you mentioned science journalist, I thought Neil deGrasse Tyson, because he's somebody who runs the Hayden Planetarium, which is already a little bit away from being a scientist, so to speak. But I've heard him speak on a variety of things, and he's so great with explaining science to a public audience, which is such a valuable skill, and just advocating for science and being a champion of science. But I heard him talk about when people ask, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? He does mention, at some point I'd like to give up all this stuff and go back to the lab. I'd like to be the scientist and do that. And so I think it's great that we have phases in our careers and time to do all of these things, but keeping in mind what you really enjoy and what you like doing is, I think, really important. I think it's a good way of framing it for people. It helps with all these options to decide
Right.
which ones are the right ones. So now you mentioned, I think just in passing there, a course that you were working on with folks about making these career choices.
So I have a class on Coursera that I teach through Wesleyan called Career Decisions from Insight to Impact.
Okay.
So if you have listeners who are listening to all this thinking, I've never really thought about how my background affects my career decisions. And maybe that's something I should give some thought to. I have a TEDx talk called The Psychology of Career Decisions that gives a taste of that. So that's a quick way of getting a bit of expansion of what I've discussed here. But then people who want a deeper dive can look at Career Decisions from Insight to Impact on Coursera. And during the pandemic, they've been offering the course for free off and on. So
what's the involvement for the course? I mean, is it a certain amount of days, weeks, months?
It's structured as a 4-week class, but it's kind of a Coursera construct as opposed to literally it takes 4 weeks to take the class.
But it sounds like it's something good for anybody to do from time to time, just to focus on where are you, what are your thoughts, what are your goals, how are you going to be intentional about them?
It's a lot of self-reflection. So in other words, it's not the kind of class where you're going out and doing a lot of heavy reading and writing long papers. It's not like that. It's all just doing self-reflective exercises. Like one of the earliest assignments I have in there is to have people do a life history interview. Find somebody else to give you this interview protocol where you're basically talking about every single thing that you've done. And then really think about what came out of that, because there's usually surprises. You didn't expect yourself to talk about those things, and why did you talk about those things, and how does that relate to some of the other topics in the course and things like that.
That sounds like fun. You got to find the right person to interview you, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I would agree.
Person to do that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Castonguay, thank you so much for joining us here today. I think that's just some tremendous insight for folks who are in our audience, who are often at a bit of a crossroads career-wise, that notion of self-reflection and what you have an affinity for, what you want to be doing, and what parts of your kind of doctoral identity are important to you, and how far away from that ideal do you want to be. I think those are some really good things for folks to think about. I really appreciate the insight. Thanks
for having me.
You're quite welcome. I'll remind folks that, once again, this episode has been brought to you by Dissertation Done. So if you are getting ready to start your dissertation, or maybe bogged down in the middle, reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/done, and we'll see what we can do to help you out with that. And if you are a professional working in the expert space and would like to become a published author and expand your authority by doing so, reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/book. and we'll have a conversation there. Again, Dr. Castonguay, thank you so much for being here today. We had a fun time.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, have a wonderful day and go out and live your unconventional life.
This has been An Unconventional Life. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe now to keep getting inspirational stories of unconventional lives as soon as they're released. Until then, go out and live your best unconventional life.